It's great that you clicked on us. You're listening and potentially watching this special edition of the Berlin Briefing podcast today from Munich, the Munich Security Conference, where, of course, we heard Marco Rubio speak, the US Secretary of State. Friedrich Merz gave a pretty broad speech on where he sees Europe heading. And I'm particularly delighted that we have as a guest here today, Jens Spahn. He's the chief whip, so to say, of the conservative CDU-CSU in the German parliament. So you're responsible for all those MPs who will now be asking questions about that particular speech. And Nina Haase joins me, DW's chief political correspondent, who also focuses on defense. So, Mr. Spahn, I would like to throw this to you first. How worried were you that we would have a Vance-like scenario who gave the European democracies a bit of a dressing down just a year ago? The Europeans had to recover from that. You're a man who's known as saying that Trump has a point fundamentally. How did you read this speech? Was it a Valentine's card?
Well, I would say the speech yesterday of the Chancellor and the speech today of Marco Rubio actually is a good chance for reboot the transatlantic relationship. So it's not about Valentine, actually. It's about going to work and going deeper into it. The speech of the Chancellor yesterday was a kind of an echo to Davos. I would say it's how Europe should react, that it is about partnership, not alignment in this transatlantic relation. And Marco Rubio today actually took it up. Of course, I mean, we know what the US administration is thinking and how they say it. I mean, nothing of this is new to us, is it? You just mentioned the speech of G.D. Vance last year, the speech of President Trump in Davos just 2 weeks ago. So actually, I would say that was a relatively calm speech, a speech actually that had several points, as you mentioned it. Too often the answer they give and the noise around the answer is somehow disturbing. But I advocate for seeing where they have a point and trying to work on this and build on this a partnership. For example, UN reforms that are needed. Both sides say they are needed. They say it in a different tone and a different approach, but then just put the noise aside and try to work on it.
Merz did say that the whole MAGA culture isn't ours. So this went beyond concrete cooperation and the demand to bolster own security capabilities. This was a more fundamental speech that Friedrich Merz held, and basically drawing a red line in the sand, what the Europeans are not, and admitting to those dependencies, which we've discussed many times. Now, we've caught up with you at many conservative events in the US as well. You are very well networked in the United States. How will that go down with the people you talk to a lot in the US?
Well, my experience is if you always try to get back to the objectives, I mean, then there is a good chance to do so. And at the same time, I mean, we need to make clear where we stand. And that is what the Chancellor did yesterday. That is what he did in Davos already, by the way. And for example, there are borders of what we can accept, limits of what we can accept. For example, I mean, 60 German soldiers died in Afghanistan. It was the US for the first and unique time pulling Article 5. And there was Trump in Davos saying, "What did you ever do for us?" And I was actually crying internally, Afghanistan.
And there was a recognition of conduct in the speech that we heard from you.
Yes. And that is where we just say very clear that is not acceptable to us. And at the same time, we just do not escalate rhetorically, but try to get back on working on this relationship. Because one thing remains true, we need the US engaged in Europe for our security. We are both better off, both sides of the Atlantic are better off economically and in many, many other regards if we work together. And to make it very concrete, there will be no ceasefire and no peace in Ukraine without the US. So yes, we need to make clear where we stand in a calm way, and then go on in just finding common ground.
But when you just say we need the US to come to peace in Ukraine, of course the Europeans want a sustainable peace, so they don't just want a ceasefire where essentially the Ukrainians are saying we don't trust Russia, so they could come back any time. Marco Rubio didn't mention Ukraine. How worrying is that? In his speech, in this whole speech, not one word about Ukraine.
Well, it was kind of surprising. And at the same time, the US obviously are engaged these days in negotiations around the Ukraine and finding a ceasefire. And just go some months back when there was the 28 points plan of President Trump, that was worrying actually, because it was trying to find a solution just between Putin and Trump, more or less, over the heads of Europe and the Ukraine. Well, we managed, Chancellor Merz managed to pull all Europeans together, leading them, together with Macron and Küfner. And in the end, there was a 20 points plan that was very different to the 28 proposed by the president in the first. And so actually, yes, they made a difference. Europe made a difference, led by the Chancellor and others, for the Ukraine. Otherwise, they would not be at the table anymore.
And to be fair, he did get asked by Mr. Ischinger, the head of the Munich Security Conference on Ukraine, and he did use the words of a sustainable peace. And he did actually recognize, and I thought that was quite a surprising degree, that Vladimir Putin seems unwilling to really engage, and that really is the open question. And that, of course, is what Friedrich Merz talked at length about. But I'm also curious, you're taking home both speeches now to your parliamentarians, who I'm sure are going to be asking many questions. And how confident are you that all those points, and there's a strong call for reform in Germany and in Europe in Friedrich Merz's speech to get fit for the future, how well is that going to go down with your MPs?
It's going down very well, actually, as I said, to make clear our stance and where we stand, what we accept and can't accept. At the same time, trying to find common ground to reboot. What was there, obviously, is not there like it was anymore. That is to be accepted. And at the same time, try to build up something else instead. What is important is we need to strengthen the European pillar within the transatlantic relationship. And that is, by the way, what the US is asking for as well, but we should do it because of our own interest. And that is the NATO pillar. And there we already have started with the exemption of the debt brake in Germany, for example. Whatever it takes, we are spending on defense, tripling and quadrupling our defense spending, the new military service. So on NATO, the European pillar already is much stronger than it was 5 or 10 years before. Sometimes I say Putin was the wake-up call and Trump was the one who was getting us up. Because one thing is to awake and the other thing is getting up and out of bed. And we obviously needed both. And now the NATO pillar, the European pillar, is stronger. But then when it comes to economic growth, for example, the US economy has grown 50 times what the German economy has grown in the last 6 years. 50 times. The gap is really widening. And so we need growth for defense when it comes to the whole of Europe, to the Iron Dome, space capabilities, nuclear deterrence. We really need to fill the gap between ambition and capability. And that is actually what I take home to Berlin and what we will work on with the MPs, Parliament, with the government in Germany and in Brussels, in Europe, that we need to fill that gap. Yes, there is ambition. There are a lot of speeches by the President of the Commission, by other European leaders, by President Macron, but now we need action.
But that brings me right back to the point, because you say we need action. Germany's pretty much bottom of the list when it comes to economic growth in Europe. So it should be growing. It's not. So there is a lot of pressure to actually come up with the goods that Friedrich Merz himself is demanding of his own government. You yourself have put proposals on the table, for instance, for inheritance tax. I mean, it all comes down to the willingness to actually reform in this coalition that is conservative-led with the Social Democrats. So what are you taking away from here? Do you believe that everybody in Berlin is suddenly going to pick up on this vibe of the Munich Security Conference and be much more willing for potentially really painful compromises? Because we did see Marco Rubio point out that the development of, despite being intertwined, we are destined to be together, we care deeply. He said the United States spent their money, their wealth, on arms, on being ready to fight in this world and defend their allies, whereas the Europeans spent it on social services and complacency. I mean, we've heard these arguments before, but
for more than 20 years, actually, we have heard them.
But in a speech from a Trump administration that started with a love letter that we are destined to all be together, that is quite new. So how confident are you that this will translate into actual government action?
Well, we started 9 months ago with the new government and the chancellor being elected in parliament. And we have made a real policy change when it comes to foreign and security policies. I just mentioned the military service, the defense spending, the leading in Europe. We have made a difference, a policy change when it comes to irregular migration, bringing it down 60%. We want to go further, but within 9 months. Homeland security, strengthening our federal police, for example. And then there is now the question of growth. After 3 years of recession, it's really brutal to the people. We really can feel it. People feel the difference it makes to have no growth. We have started energy costs, taxes, but the main task for this year is labor costs, labor productivity, social security, pension, health, elderly care. We need to adapt to an aging society that will need difficult decisions, that's for sure. And then the question is again, if we actually bring back from all these conferences what we say here and actually what our ambition is to make that difference, to bring back growth, to make, only a growing economy is a good partner for anyone in the world, finds good trade deals and so on. We need to make that change, to make that reform in Berlin. And that is what I take back from here. I mean, 14 ministers of the German government have been attending here in Munich, including the finance minister, the minister of economic affairs, and many, many others. And so actually now it's about action back in Berlin. And I expect all of us in this coalition to now make that difference.
And can I just ask you, because you have all these conversations with people here, also European allies, are people aware in Europe that, yes, Germany has a lot of money at the moment available to spend on defense, but it is because Germany is taking on a lot of debt, and it's not sustainably financed, if you will, because the economic growth is lagging behind. So what kind of a feeling do you get when you talk to European allies who say, sorry, we can't because we've got too much debt, so we can't invest more in our own security and defense?
Well, first of all, most allies and partners in Europe somehow are happy to satisfy that we do what we do. Some would say finally, I would say at the right time, exemption from the debt brake and investments in infrastructure. But one thing is important. We are the only G7 state with a AAA rating right now. We are almost the only one within the Eurozone. We are the fiscal protective power of the Eurozone. If we make too much debt, more than we can afford, it's harming the whole Eurozone and the whole of Europe. So what we need to add, and that brings us back to reform, is growth. Without growth, it's not sustainable. And that is actually the story we not just need to tell, but that we need to show that with all the debt we are making now, and that is really a policy change for Germany. Really, I was deputy finance minister 10 years ago, and we had the black zero, no new debt. Really a policy change, but that needs to come with growth for the sake not just of Germany, but for the whole Eurozone. And that is what I keep on telling our European partners. Only making debt is not the solution. On the European level now and again, several proposals from several governments, new and more debt, as if it was the solution to everything. Competitiveness is not made by new debt. You need structural reforms. That is why the meeting on Thursday in Belgium was so important of the European leaders to focus on competitiveness and the reports of Letta and Draghi. And that is why it is important for us in Germany to make our homework finally after 3 years of recession.
Michaela, we need to be transparent. There are only 3 seats here in this studio, and we do want to get another perspective. So from somebody else, I'm just going to hand over back to and thank you very much.
So people are coming and going. This gives an impression
We'll see it.
nature of the quick meetings we had.
Yeah.
Great to see you again, Ian. Bremmer, of course, the director and founder of Eurasia Group. So great to catch up with you. You've been able to listen in for a couple of minutes.
I have, yeah.
So
I didn't realize there were that many German ministers that were here in attendance. I mean, I get proximity has its advantages, right?
Have you worked your way through all of them?
Absolutely. I'm getting there one by one.
I was surprised too. I saw them all yesterday lining up, but it's a good sign, isn't it?
It's a good sign. Yeah.
They're all here.
Well, they're certainly all going to be aware, and also in delivering what you just mapped out, that there is this need for structural reform, which of course will be to a large degree your homework, frankly. But we didn't get to China, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But I'm first of all, you just listened in for the last couple of minutes. So is there a question you would like to pose?
Look, I certainly appreciate that the Germans have homework to do, and that's one piece of the puzzle. But of course, the Americans also have to rebuild trust. I mean, Ukraine wasn't mentioned in Marco Rubio's speech in opening. The Europeans doing an awful lot that the Americans are not. We're not. He didn't mention Greenland. That's probably a good thing. But that episode is not forgotten. I'm hearing from a lot of European leaders that it's not just the Germans that have homework to do. What homework do you think the Americans have to do?
First of all, to understand how much harm the last weeks have done, indeed, to the public image of the US here in Europe. I mean, take, for example, Denmark. Denmark, I would say, was one, if not the most pro-transatlantic country in Europe. If you take all the polls before and now, it really has gone down, the approval rates of the US and the transatlantic relationship. For example, there have more than Danish soldiers died in Afghanistan related to the size of the population than US soldiers have. And of course, that really has harmed. And that is not just, it's like in a marriage. If you had such a argument in public, even with such harsh words, it takes some time to repair. It's not just the next day you do as nothing has happened. And if you ask me what the Americans need to do, first of all, they need to understand that their harm has been done to the relationship, and that all the noises that are made, not just in the last weeks, but actually over months now, of course, have their impact on the public opinion. You really can see the approval rates of the transatlantic relationships going down, and that's actually hurting me. I want it the other way, and to repair that, it takes time, and it definitely takes a different approach.
But more likely, of course, Donald Trump looked at the opinion polls in the United States, which were absolutely not in favor of doing anything on Greenland. And I do want to add that the White House posted today a set of Valentine's cards, one of which includes a picture of Greenland in a heart, saying it's time we define our situationship. So there are clearly...
Hey, that's better than putting an American flag on it. That's progress. That's what, look, Rubio was, it was same policy as the U.S., but, from Vance, Rubio represents progress. From where the U.S. was on Greenland. It's not like Trump is ever going to apologize. He never does anything wrong, but he does occasionally move on from the things that he did that were problematic. And this is one of those cases in my view.
Thanks for the card. There was no need for this card. This is not necessarily himself. Cheers. But anyway, I didn't know how much longer we can have you in here. Okay, wonderful. Then it wasn't just Marco Rubio who's speaking today. We already discussed the Merz speech on Friday, but do feel free to reference back to that. We also heard from Wang Yi, the Chinese foreign minister, and he, again in the Q&A, which is very often the most interesting bit, was pretty clear on the relationship with the United States, and that, of course, one wants to have a dialogue, but the or else we are also prepared for anything else. I thought was very interesting. In parallel, we had a direct meeting between Merz and Rubio. Both readouts looked pretty much the same. One mentioned China, one more supply chains. I guess that's the same thing. But there was also a bit of a threat within that Chinese speech that the whole supply chains shouldn't be separated. So I'm just wondering how you read that and how you deduct homework for the Europeans, as in for instance, the chief whip of the Conservative Party, which is the party of the Chancellor here in Germany?
Well, I'm certainly very interested in Jens's view on this. I mean, my understanding is that the Europeans still today see that competitive threat to their economy and to core sectors like chemicals and automobiles, for example, aviation. I mean, this is the Chinese. It's not the United States. And so ultimately, concern, especially about the massive export surplus that China has in manufacturing, the only part of their economy that's really working well right now, like that's not going to go away anytime soon. And I mean, ultimately, there's a big problem that the Europeans have with the Trump administration. But the Europeans have a structural issue with China, right? As does the United States. Like, they were integrated into a global economy on the presumption that the Chinese political and economic system would actually adapt to the West. That hasn't happened. They're much more powerful. They're much more capable. Their supply chains are much more integrated, as it were. But I mean, they're still state capitalists. They're still authoritarian. That's a real problem. I mean, they're two completely different systems, and it's hard to see how well the Europeans can coexist in a system of that strength that is so fundamentally misaligned in how it operates globally with the way the Europeans run their market. And again, I'm really interested in Jens on this.
Well, first of all, I do agree when it comes to dependencies that have grown in the last years. But nevertheless, first of all, in the last decades, both economies, the European, especially the German one and the Chinese one, have benefited. Both sides have benefited from this economic relationship that is there. Right now, we have a much bigger leverage on China than we every now and then see ourselves in Europe. Why? And China has overcapacities in many areas. You just mentioned some. The American market is more or less closed for many of these products. The domestic demand is in disarray. It's just not working. They still have real estate problem, all of this. So they really need to sell it to Europe. There's no other continent that actually could take it anyway. So we have a leverage by controlling entrance into our market, a leverage we don't use very well from my regard. We have started to use it when it comes to EVs, when it comes to steel and aluminium. As soon as we see subsidies or state activities that is an unfair competition, we can retaliate, and we do so. But we do it in a tailored way, not tariffs on everything and not putting everything in question that is there on the table, but to do it in a tailored way and to answer. And then there is the principle of reciprocity. If we can't buy ports in China, why should you be able to buy ports in Europe? And to implement all of this in a more tailored way, because we do have a different situation than the US towards China, with much more economic integration that is there in place. We do diversify. Take Mercosur. I mean, the deal with India, trade deal with India. No one would have expected that 6 months ago, 12 months ago to happen so fast. But still,
yeah.
we are getting Mercosur, India, Indonesia on its way, Australia. We're really on the way to make a difference and to diversify. It's de-risking. And then perhaps we can be, if we do it in a right way, we can be a pivot between the US and China. The ones actually, perhaps you can make more out of this situation than it's right now. Everyone seems to treat Europe somehow, and we react. And I think we need to go back into a kind of driver's seat, but to define our role in this. And we are not the US, we are not China. We find our own role in this, and that can be this kind of pivoting thing in the middle, not small but big, but still deciding where much of it goes. One important question regarding China needs to be asked, though, first of all, and that is what Wolfgang Ischinger said at the beginning of this conference. Do they use the leverage they have on Russia to end this war? And the chancellor will be traveling to Beijing in March. Others of us will go. And already in the past meetings, we always ask them that questions. You are actually putting burden on your relation with Europe by supporting Russia. And you have to calculate when the burden you put on your relationship with Europe is more costful than what you gain from your relation with Russia? And I think that question needs to be asked every day and every hour.
In fact, the Chinese Foreign Minister did get that question, whether he's doing everything. And he basically said, there's need for dialogue. Yeah, he said, well, they always say, but I just want to make it transparent. He does keep getting that question. And it's always the same answer.
Look, I mean, there's no question that the Chinese are more engaged with the Russians and are treating the Russians more warmly than they are the Ukrainians, even though they, of course, have economic deals and interests in both. But then again, you could make that argument about President Trump. I mean, the reality is that Ukraine is getting far more pressure from Trump than the Russians are. Trump is talking much more about the economic opportunities that could emerge from a deal with the Russians than he is with the Ukrainians. And this puts the Europeans in a very, very difficult position. Again, I know that you don't want to say that publicly, and you certainly can't say it publicly in a direct meeting with Trump. But the unfortunate reality is that Trump wants a ceasefire, and he doesn't mind if that ceasefire is on the back of capitulation from the Ukrainians. That's very clear. And frankly, that aligns pretty well with China's perspective on Russia and Ukraine.
Yeah. Yes, Spahn, I want to put this in a question that you can actually answer. I'm sure you're capable of, but you have to be diplomatic about things. I do appreciate that as well. But in terms of, it all comes back to trust. If you take say the Europeans should be in a situation of a pivot rather than squeezed in between. I find it really interesting because you were a minister under Angela Merkel, and Angela Merkel very much was concerned about getting that question about how Europe would decide either the US or China.
If we need to decide between the two, it's clear.
It's clear.
US.
Exactly. But this is a question she did not even want to really have to handle. I find it very interesting that you see a much more positive way out on this. But it comes down to this whole concept of the West that clearly was in Rubio's speech today, and that was a lot more differentiated in Friedrich Merz's speech on Friday, where he wants to make a much clearer differentiation between what the Europeans are. We believe in rights, not infringing on other people's rights. We do not believe in MAGA that is crossing a line for us for the first time. That's a very big difference to the Davos speech. And the US, which is saying that we're historically intertwined. We cannot live without each other. So we are going to be the West. We have to make it work. I'm being oversimplistic. But do you still fully trust, or how much damage to the trust has been done? You spoke about that damage, looking at where we stand right now.
I still have much trust in the transatlantic relationship. Do I have trust in every second and every movement and every person? No. But in general, I do have a fundamental trust. And both, by the way, can be true. That there is this special relationship, and at the same time, we are different. Europe is different from the US, historically, geographically, in many, many regards. And at the same time, it's a special relationship of the Western normative world. And by the way, we are very different within Europe too. You know, we share common dreams, but we have different nightmares. The Finns and the Baltics see Russia very different to Portugal, perhaps, the sense of urgency. Or the sense of urgency of migration from North Africa is felt differently in Malta or in Ireland. So within Europe, we do have differences too, but we share common dreams, common ambitions, and we know we are better off together. And that counts for Europe. And that counts transatlantically. And so, yes, we are different, and I think we should accept that. And we see things differently. And at the same time, within this transatlantic partnership, there's more in common than there is with others. For example, with Mercosur, it counts for the South American countries, by the way, too. Culturally, they are much closer to us, to Europeans, obviously, than we are with almost every other part of the world. And so we should build on this. And when it comes to, he mentioned again, of course, migration. Defense, already said, the European pillar, but migration. I mean, we have an issue with irregular migration, and it is changing our societies. So that's what I mean when I say they have a point often. My answer would be different every now and then, but the point is there. And obviously, we have stress in our societies because of this irregular migration. Obviously, we have to balance climate action and remaining in this industrial state? That is really an issue for Germany these days. That is one of the questions we need to answer to bring back growth. Do we want to keep our industrial cores, automotive industry, chemical industry, all the energy intensive industries, or not? And so I would say, if I take the topics, the objectives, and take away all the noise and perhaps some of the answers, I would say we can find common ground.
Thank you very much. With that, Jens Spahn, I have to let you go. Unfortunately, I apologize for overstretching this. Jens Spahn, the leader of the conservative CDU-CSU group, it's an open secret that you're one of the leading figures within the conservative camp to look out for. So you probably heard him here and saw him here first. So thank you again for your
having me.
And
Ian, all the best. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks. Thanks so much. Thank you very much. So I'm playing music. It's very much an MSC episode, isn't it? Where you do speed dating. So yeah. So how did your speed dating go?
Well, so first of all, on the back of the last speed dating, so I mean the analogy, I loved his idea that we have, sort of common dreams but different nightmares. The U.S. and the Europeans have had a strong and special relationship that is unique. We're married. Right, but the relationship has become abusive, and that is problematic, right? And that's hard to get past, and that's true from the European perspective. From the American perspective, it's like, well, you're just not bringing very much to that relationship anymore.
House,
one owns the house.
Can I just say, Ian, because I don't know, I keep hearing those family comparisons, right?
Yes.
And I just think, have people made up their minds who is who? Because we heard the US ambassador to NATO in the kickoff event speak of the US as the parents who are looking at the Europeans with a lot of love. We love you deeply, but mum and dad really need you to get a job now. This is what he said, right? Then Marco Rubio stands on the stage and says, well, basically, we are your children because, we all came from Europe and the Americans. And
yeah, that's nice, but it's not the way it is.
Yeah, no, you're saying, and this is, I think, the way that the Europeans would like to see it. The US and the Europeans are married, but there is a bit of a problem and they're having to figure out, is it a divorce yet, or are we just taking a break, or are we just seeing other people on the side? So, all these relationship comparisons, what is it?
Yeah, it's not a divorce, of course. But I mean, it is absolutely not a happy, loving relationship. And, first understanding that there is a problem in the relationship, that's been accomplished in the last year. I mean, I do think there's a level of honesty. Maybe it's brutality in its honesty, but it's honesty that neither country is comfortable with where the relationship presently stands. The Trump administration doesn't like the European Union. They don't like a lot of what the EU stands for. The Europeans certainly aren't comfortable with MAGA, and they don't like the way the Americans are behaving unilaterally and transactionally and throwing away a lot of what the European think is about and unpredictable.
And they have own relationship problems amongst themselves.
Clearly. And so, look, I think that understanding the problem is the first step to resolving it. But we haven't gone very far beyond understanding the problem. And I think that we can go farther than that, and we should. And I'm happy to give you some ideas around that. And we're having the conversation. I think the next step is to recognize a fundamental difference between those areas of the relationship where U.S. national interest has indeed changed in ways that are less aligned with Europe. And it's been coming for a long time. It's not about Trump. Trump is a symptom, but he's not the cause. A free trade.
What the U.S. stands for. I think one can't disregard that the internal struggle the U.S. is having with itself and its own values and its own democracy.
Yeah, I understand. Yeah. But those things, I am saying that America has been evolving for 20 plus years away from free trade. The Europeans really care about America's role as the architect of global free trade. That's gone. Obama found that out. Hillary found that out. Trump found that out. Biden found that out. Trump's finding that out again, right? So it's much more tariffs. I don't care who the next president is. You're going to see more subsidies, more industrial policy, more tariffs in the United States. That's a reality. Mm-hmm. It's structural. The Europeans have to adjust to it. It is a reality that the Americans are going to do less from a common burden-sharing defense perspective, and that is structural. Mm-hmm. That's been coming for a long time. Obama talked about it, didn't push very hard. They're pushing a lot more now.
but it's been coming.
Getting the results.
And they're getting the results. Absolutely.
But saying we're no longer providing weapons to Ukraine, we're only going to sell them to you. That is a fundamental and complete change.
I want to make a difference between those areas where American interests have evolved over time, and they will continue to evolve, and they're different from what they were before.
And the Europeans could have been prepared.
They should have been prepared. Then there is a second component, which the Europeans absolutely should not have been prepared for. And that is those areas where President Trump, specifically President Trump, is actually putting forward his personal interests as opposed to the interests of the United States as a whole. Yes, of course. But he sees those as personal interests. He's putting them forward as opposed to the interests of the country. Greenland is a good example of this. There was absolutely zero interest in Trump to negotiate the national interests of the U.S. with NATO, with Denmark, with Greenland, with any of the allies. It was purely about ego, a little bit of money. This has to be mine. That is absolutely not in the interest of the United States. It's truly not. It is just Trump. There's a big gap there. We've never seen that in history before. And on those issues, the Europeans need to be resolute. They should be surprised, but they also need to understand that those things will not persist beyond Trump. That unreliability and unpredictability you're talking about, that is specific to this guy. And when Trump is gone, and Trump is already getting constrained and pushed back on this kind of stuff, on Greenland, on Minneapolis and ICE, on saying he's going to nationalize the elections. And immediately the Republican heads of the Senate and the House come out publicly and say, no, you're not. That's not happened before. So when the Europeans that have this special relationship with the U.S. see that the president of the U.S. is acting in ways that are not actually aligned with the country, whoa, now that's a problem for everybody. That's not just a problem for Europe. It's a problem for the world. It's a problem for America. But it's not going to persist. And so I think that we have to, if you want to start figuring out not just what the problem is, but how you're going to respond to it, let us collectively understand that there are two different types of problems, one of which is long-term, structural, persistent, that we can respond. The other is deeply urgent, but not permanent.
But both together are rocket fuel. And that's also what Friedrich Merz made that argument to this so-called multipolar world, call it whatever you want, where the United States no longer has that singular role. Also, when you look in terms of military might in China catching up so fast. So that really is something that the United States could have at least dragged out.
Yes, but again, I would say that structurally, beyond Trump is an accelerant of this. So rocket fuel, okay. But the global economy is multipolar. I think it's multipolar today. Yeah. The EU is a common market. It has that competence. It shows that it's capable of responding. When Greenland hit and the Europeans said, we're going to hit you back with tariffs, and the markets in the U.S. react, the Americans back down. That's multipolarity. When Trump puts tariffs on China and escalates them, and the Chinese respond with reciprocal tariffs and critical minerals licenses restrictions, the Americans back down. That's multipolarity. Now, when I look at security and I see that the Europeans don't have a ball game without the Americans selling weapons, when I look at security and I see that Trump is going to make a decision about decapitating or not the supreme leader of Iran, and he's going to do that with literally zero thought of how the Europeans might think about this. Really zero thought. Let us not pretend that the security order is becoming multipolar. It is not. It's not even close.
And the question is, of course, because you say that these two are separate questions and that some of the things will go away once Trump is not there anymore. Are you sure of that? Because he does have a bit of time to rebuild the democratic institutions. Is that not a fear that the Europeans should also consider? I know.
Am I not sure of that? I am reasonably confident. I would like to be sure of it. I'm not, especially as an American. I mean, the idea that the U.S. might be going through a process that eventually sees it look more like Hungary or more like Turkey, that's a horrible thing to say. There are fellow citizens of mine who really believe that. I don't. The U.S. election system is not run by Washington. It's run by states. It's very hard to change that. There are judges that are preventing Trump from doing things all the time that are illegal. The things he does make headlines. The reaction, the pushback, the failures don't. So you see all of this effort of erosion of values and the rest. Now, I will say, I was asked yesterday by a European head of state in a bilateral whether I thought the U.S. was going to have free and fair elections in November. And my response was, you think that the Americans have had free and fair elections in the last 20 years? Like, are you kidding me? With billions of dollars being spent by special interests to ensure they get the policy outcomes that they want, you think those are free and fair elections? Why do you think Trump won? Trump won out of a sense of grievance that the U.S. election system is not run the way that Europeans run the election system. Well, that's important. So there are things that are broken.
Having been an election observer in the United States in the past, we could have a separate debate on how that system is built. There are historical reasons for it, but there is no perfect democratic system. It's true, not every vote carries the same weight. It's true, there was a disastrous Supreme Court ruling which basically allows you to spend as much money as you want.
That's what, having that on Tuesdays doesn't help when people have to work.
In expert circles, that is a cardinal sin of U.S. democracy, actually. Everything else you can make work, but if you can pour endless amounts of money into something, those who have the most have pretty good chances of being out on top. So, but let's just conclude this with a look into the future, because your core job is that crystal ball as well. So I'm going to get your thoughts, both your thoughts. What is going to be the key issue we talk about in 1 year's time when we sit back down here and just assess what happened in the last year? What's going to be the core theme?
So I don't think there's going to be a core theme. I think there'll be a few things that will matter a lot. One that we can predict with a reasonable amount of confidence is that the significant losses that Trump will face in November in the midterm elections will make the U.S. political system look different and will create a sense of possibility, even if a lot of uncertainty, for the Europeans that we don't have right now. So that's one theme that will be significant. A second, and the Codel that reflects that, and the leaders that reflect that. Right now, you've got AOC and you've got Gavin Newsom, who are like, sort of rowdy oppositionists, but they don't have power. Yeah, they don't have power. It'll feel different next year. A second thing that will matter a lot is, given a year of the Ukrainians not getting support from the United States and the massive human challenge that puts on the much smaller Ukrainians, even as the Russians lose 30,000 soldiers a month, which is incredible to think about. What does that look like? Especially because I think it's quite plausible that Trump will end up, if he can't get a ceasefire, that he will do a deal with the Russians without a ceasefire. He'll pull back on sanctions, he'll do it unilaterally, and he'll make a lot of money. And that is, if that happens, if I'm right about that, that is going to be an utterly core theme of Munich next year. But then the third thing, which we haven't talked that much about in this Munich, but it's incredibly important, is how much NATO and security is being changed by what the companies are doing, by AI. And I mean, this is still so much of a geopolitical moment, but we're not spending the time on these new technologies that aren't really in the competence directly of what the governments are doing on a daily basis. They're regulating themselves. But increasingly, that's not just about labor. It's not just about information. It's about security. Mm-hmm. And as that ramps up, the fact that the Americans are exporting those models, like Jens is right, the Europeans do have economic competence, and it is multipolar there. The Europeans don't have a tech strategy, not even close. And the Americans may not have a strategy, but they have power.
They have tech.
That's the reality.
They're only looking for energy. That's all they need.
And so I suspect that is going to be a much bigger theme next year.
Okay. Yeah. Although Europe has some tech as well when it comes to industrial AI, I did want to mention that as well. So, Nina, that neatly leads us to your final thought on what do you think on what you're going to be watching out for.
I think you're absolutely spot on when it comes to the challenges of tech for European militaries. I mean, if you speak to defense people, when it comes to procurement, etc., especially in Europe, people have treated it as a sort of this is what we do, but we don't really need it. So these are our procedures, and this is how we've done it. We develop a system, and then once it's finished, we put it in a box, and then we don't use it ever, but it runs out after 5 years. You get the idea. Now they're going to have to reinvent themselves. They're going to have to become American by mindset. Let's just put it out there, see if it works, learn from the Ukrainians who are having to use all these systems. And that is going to be a massive, massive challenge, especially when you look at how little money there is in Europe, really. I mean, we talked about Germany's defense spending essentially debt funded. The French are broke, and the British government is not even, part of the European Union, also wobbling. So, I mean, this is going to be a massive, massive challenge. Really, Europe coming together in defense.
Okay, well, plenty to look out for. Thank you so much, Nina Haase, DW Chief Political Correspondent, and Ian Bremmer, founder and leader of the Eurasia think tank group. It's fantastic to have your analysis, as always. We'll probably reconvene in a year's time, but the next Berlin briefing is coming up.
The midterm elections.
The next Berlin briefing, of course, will be coming up from Berlin next week. If you have any thoughts, more questions, want more details, just send us a message, drop us a line. We're also going to be dropping some interviews below here so you get a good idea of what we've been up to. Thank you.